I'm Michael, I'm founder of Emission Maritime. Okay, very good. Yeah, we'll do that. So we're a clean tech design, engineering and technology, system integration, consultancy business focused on the inshore commercial maritime sector. And we say we're on a mission to decarbonise the harbour cities of the world. We try hard to focus on investing in the development of standardised vessel platforms, and we assist operators and public transport authorities to build those with their local shipyards. And so in doing this, we're helping boat builders around the world to become electric boat builders and operators and public transport authorities to adopt electric with confidence. And we're a team of 10 people, engineers, electrical engineers, naval architects and project managers, and our office is just opposite Ports of Auckland's Captain Cook Wharf. In fact, those that know the New Zealand Maritime School, we're downstairs in that building. So now, as many of you guys may know, I've been deeply involved in the move to electrify the Auckland ferry fleet, and some might say it's all my fault. But so today I'm going to give a little bit of background to that and be asked to talk about the green shoots of Auckland's zero-emission maritime future, and maybe a little bit lighter and less challenging, mostly, than some of what we've heard about. I'm conscious that I'm the person that stands between you and a beer at Swashbucklers. So, you know, I'm going to give you some background, and then before you start throwing things at me for complicating your lives as surveyors, I'm going to tell you why it matters and reflect on some of what we see going on here and around the world, and what in the near and middle and longer term it's likely to look like in this space. So, for me, the green shoots of the Emission Maritime story date back to 2017. I'm an engineer and naval architect by background, but in 2017 I was CEO of a shipyard here in Auckland called McMillan & Wing, which I joined in 2011. At that stage it was a super yacht builder, and I'd led it through its transition to become to really focus on serving the wider Auckland commercial fleet. Ferries were an important part of their business, and these are boats that need a lot of maintenance. They're pushed hard, they're running big hours, on a rigorous schedule, and even in 2017 the fleet was ageing. And all eyes back then were on Auckland Transport. Existing ferry operating contracts were coming to their end, and operators were looking to the security of the new contracts to invest into new boats. Based on AT's service aspirations, it would have seen 15 or 20 more boats built in a pretty short period of time. So it was a pretty serious business for the New Zealand commercial boat building scene at that time. That's what we're looking at. But building boats in New Zealand had become expensive, and there was a growing mood for building in the developing world. And as an industry, we knew we couldn't expect the work to just land on our laps. So I started to lean into understanding our clients' needs. Not just the operators, but the more strategic forces, Auckland Transport, Auckland Council, central government. This wasn't about building cheaper boats, it was about supporting Auckland to deliver a public good better. And public transport is about getting cars off roads and helping people choose more sustainable ways to move around our cities. And there's more on the reality of the sustainability of that later, but for the moment, suffice to say that I read a lot of government policy, climate strategies and action plans. And in 2017, central and local government were getting serious about climate action. Auckland had joined the C40 cities in 2015. New Zealand had an emissions trading scheme. Parliament was beginning work on what would later become the Zero Carbon Act, which was eventually passed in 2019. And public and private sector businesses outside the marine space were starting to report on their emissions. It's fair to say they were mostly trying to greenwash their current activities in the short term while they figured out how on earth they were going to change things in the longer term. Nevertheless, they were increasingly focused on the scale of their emissions and understanding how much change would be needed to make a difference. That movement, the climate action movement, was pretty modest here compared with Europe and especially Scandinavia, particularly in the maritime space. While the Norwegians had launched Ampere in 2014, and were actively claiming a dominant position in the global supply chain for marine electrification, down here most of the industry was still pretty focused on cost. At an overall level, there was very little buyer interest in innovation or improvement, and so designers were largely focused on how to keep building the same boats cheaper to fend off competition from the developing world for a little while longer. But there were, at that point, a few notable exceptions. East by West ferries in Wellington were starting to design an electric ferry. Ports of Auckland were at the early stage of their journey that would ultimately see them ordering Sparky in 2019. The founders of what is now VESAV were thinking about energy efficiency at that stage of hydrofoiling container ships. And we were exploring the viability of electric passenger ferries at the 200 passenger size that we knew well from the Auckland fleet. When I first took this to Auckland Transport, it's fair to say they were pretty dismissive. The individual I was dealing with at that stage, who doesn't work there anymore, was pretty focused on his plan that would ultimately see AT owning a very large fleet of cheap-to-buy, expensive-to-run diesel ferries from Vietnam, or somewhere similar, much as Transport for New South Wales was in the process of doing at the time. Fullers, on the other hand, were much more interested. Like us, they'd been looking at their role in their city at a much more strategic level and had identified emissions reduction as a double-edged issue in the current system. Compared with cars, ferries were a significant net benefit. But ferries were nonetheless the standout high emitter of the public transport modes. You'll see a statistic that gets used a lot, but ferries deliver 6% of the public transport journeys in Auckland and represent 21% of the emissions from those journeys. There are much more, there's anybody that actually really thinks very hard about that statistic will say, yeah, but all the trains are electric, so you'd kind of expect it to be disproportionate, right? But as you'll see a bit later on, there's there's a real story in the back here as to why these things need to decarbonise. But I think, as Liam mentioned, Fuller's aspired to, well, maybe didn't mention, but coming to that breakfast session that Liam was talking about, that I'll talk about in a moment, Fuller's, I think, aspired to ferries playing a greater role in our city, and I'm sure they knew that demonstrating low emissions was going to be key to winning the political support for that vision to come about. And in November 2018, Fuller's held a breakfast event presenting their vision for the future of ferries in Auckland, Gulf 2025 it was called. And they presented some independent work that they'd commissioned, looking at quantifying the contribution of ferries to our city. That included emissions and various other aspects of what ferries did for our city, as well as their vision for an expanded network that Liam put the picture of up on the screen, an early version of that. I was invited to speak on where technology would take us. And by then we'd done enough work to know pretty well what was possible. I was able to articulate a very clear vision of a zero-emission ferry future for Auckland. Full-size, full-speed, fast-charging battery electric ferries delivering the inner and mid-harbour services, hydrogen on some of the outer routes. And this wasn't only a ferry future, it was an industry future, a pathway which drew on the best of New Zealand maritime innovation. Now, to their great credit, Fuller's bought into that vision and threw their support behind us quite early on. Together, we did a lot of work looking at economic modelling, service simulations, high-level design investigations. And in 2019, Fuller's lent us some of the money that we needed to help make the investments to bring electric fast ferries to fruition, as well as providing valuable operational insights. That was framed as, here's some money, $250,000, substantial amount of money, as a sort of a preliminary payment towards a deposit on 2 boats. We were keen to go and we're going to build 2 boats together like this. And then COVID came along. And as Liam said, Fuller's is 2 things. Fuller's is a public transport business and they're a tourism business. Both of those things were pretty well shaken by COVID. So when everybody was claiming that they were making sourdough all the time, the Fuller's team and the Emission Maritime team were kind of locked in our computers, putting together applications for shovel-ready infrastructure funding under the government's COVID relief program. And in 2020, Fuller's joined with Emission Maritime and Vector to apply to the government for that funding, and it ultimately resulted in the contract that we now have to deliver 2 fully electric fast ferries to Auckland Transport. So, this green shoots of Auckland's maritime future, has been going on for us since 2017. Fuller's has been there all the way along, and I'd really like to acknowledge and thank Fuller's, and particularly Mike and Tim and Liam here, I guess for drinking that Kool-Aid from the start with us and for making our vision your own. I've said before, this is how we change the world, and this is how we save a ferry service that is an important part of the fabric of our city. Now, saving a ferry service, you might think that sounds a little bit extreme. But those that are close enough to the action will know that ferry services are under a lot of scrutiny. They're seen as expensive to deliver and hard to scale, maybe a gateway drug into public transport, but not a core service. No one really takes this seriously as a central part of moving 100 million people around Auckland. Gulf Harbour and Northcote Point have been on the blocks for some time with declining patronage. They've both been given a temporary stay of execution following political intervention, but the axe remains hanging. Birkenhead patronage is reportedly dropping, as the frequency and cost of bus services has seen ferry demand heavily cannibalised. With a city with growing transport problems, how can this be so? Well, let's see what the data says. Here we're going to look at the AT network. I'll just leave that there. I've got a few slides for you to look at, and otherwise it's just a bit of decoration so you don't get too distracted. We're going to have a bit of a look at the AT network, which now picks up all the mainland ferry routes. Devonport, Bayswater, Northcote Birkenhead, West Harbour, Hobsonville Beach Haven, Half Moon Bay, Pine Harbour and Gulf Harbour. And it excludes the island services, Rakino Ferry and all the other private ferries that serve Waiheke, Terry Island, Rotorua, Murihi, Rangitoto. So not thinking about the islands, just thinking about the mainland stuff. We're going to look at data from 2019 because that's what we have available, and it predates the kind of changes that we had through COVID. So things are largely back to pre-COVID ridership levels, and there's a few changes in the patterns of behaviour on that, and ferries actually recovered really well, but data from 2019 is what we're going to use, and it's representative enough. So you can see here, this is here's those main routes, and your annual patronage in 2019 on that. It's about 3.3 million passenger journeys in 2019 across all those routes. I'd say, yeah, 3.3 million, which is about half of all of the ferry journeys taken on ferries in Auckland overall. Now, of these, Devonport has by far the highest patronage, as you can see. 1.8 million people take this ferry each year. An average of 63 passengers on each of the 30,000 one-way trips delivered annually, roughly. Bayswater is a much smaller service with around 220,000 passengers on about 12,000 trips, so an average of about 18 passengers per one-way trip. But there's a few standout services here, actually. Half Moon Bay, Gulf Harbour and West Harbour all run pretty solid passenger numbers. And if you think 30 or 40 people on average isn't that many, consider that these are really commuter services with some inter-peak stuff. There's a very strong directionality in those services, so with most people heading into town in the morning and heading home in the evening. So numbers in the on-peak direction are very much higher than average, and the off-peak direction very much lower. If you put all that another way, you're looking at 500 to 1,000 commuters each day on each of the key routes, a lot more than that on Devonport. But that's an awful lot of cars being taken off roads. And if you look at the equivalent distance by road, those same Auckland passengers would cover nearly double the distance if they were driving. Ferry journeys offset about 37 million passenger kilometres of on-road travel per year. Quite a lot. And if we look at Devonport, this is super efficient. It's only 3 kilometres by sea as opposed to 23 kilometres by road. The boats travel slowly so they don't burn a lot of diesel. And per passenger emissions on that service are only 10% of what they would be in single occupancy petrol car, and only 25% of what they would be if you rode the bus. It is faster, nicer and more eco-friendly than any other way of getting from there to here. Bayswater is pretty good too. Although it has a lot fewer trips and fewer passengers, it's a slow trip and much shorter by boat than by road. And so the ferry has about half the emissions of a single occupancy car on a per passenger basis, and about the same as a bus, albeit again, much faster and much more pleasant. It's when we look past the inner harbour that the troubles come, and this is the bit which says this is why we're doing this. This is what this electrification is all about. Every other ferry route in the Auckland transport network has higher emissions than if all of those passengers used single occupancy petrol cars. So let's break that down. So you can see here that the blue is this is the average emissions per passenger. So on the ferry, the Devonport ferry, you can see the little tiny blue bar there, tiny emissions per passenger, much, much higher on a car. A single occupancy car is about half the average emissions of riding the bus, on average across the network. Bayswater, you can see there that the ferry is still the lowest emission option. Even Birkenhead is significantly higher. All of these other modes, very, very significantly higher, and really gets big when you look at Pine Harbour and Gulf Harbour. But Devonport moves half the passengers of the whole network, and so it moves so many people over so many trips that the benefits from that service drag down the emissions of ferries and make the whole system look pretty good. Simply put, though, the power of numbers of the Devonport service are covering up the problems in the rest of the fleet. And the fact that it's a complete shortcut, that's right, because the other ones, are only, if you look at these other ones, it's kind of double the distance to go by road, whereas up here it's, 5 or 10 times the distance. But also, boats going slow don't use as much energy as boats going fast. There's a disproportionality there. And of course, on something like Devonport, you've just got so many, there's that whole argument that the boat's going anyway, and you've got lots of boats, lots of people, it's busy all through the day, and so your kind of averages are really, it's a really, really effective service, and a very well-run service, I should say too. And of course, back in 2019, the patronage on the Gulf Harbour service was quite good at an average of 36 passengers per one-way trip. It was second only to Half Moon Bay of those mid and outer harbour services. Even then, ferry emissions are about 50% higher than single occupancy cars on the Gulf Harbour service, and 3 times of what it would be catching the bus. And since then, Gulf Harbour patronage has fallen away quite a lot, and so the numbers would be a lot worse if you re-ran them. Now remember that Auckland has committed to halving transport emissions by 2030. So how do you do that in the ferry fleet? You either decarbonise your ferries or you stop running them. You would reduce the net emissions by 25% by taking all of the people that used to use the Gulf Harbour and Pine Harbour ferries and putting them back into single occupancy petrol cars. And you'd save a lot of money too. I'm not promoting that for a moment. I think it's a terrible idea. But these are some of the pieces of information that the decision makers are using.
Can I just check the statistic?
Yeah.
So one of the key things I certainly look at, I live in where we were, very close to Gulf Harbour. It can take me 2.5 hours to drive to work. That's 34 miles.
But it might take you 45 minutes and you don't know which, right?
But it's more often 2 hours than it's 45 minutes.
I'm sure it is. Yeah, yeah.
And single occupancy cars are the problem.
Yeah. I mean, slight diversion, but I live in the opposite end of the city limits, right? I live just outside Howick, and we have the 735 bus goes past my house each day, and I get on it at 7 o'clock in the morning, and the ferry takes me to Half Moon Bay, and the ferry drops me at work at 8:15, and I do the same thing in reverse at night. The odd times that I have to drive into town, I hate it. I can't believe how long I spent putting up with driving. It is just a properly inferior way of getting around the city. I don't know why anybody does it. I honestly don't. It's terrible. Public transport is so much better.
Maybe getting to some of these, that's a very interesting point. Comparing single occupancy petrol car use and carbon as a comparator, fascinating. You've also got time and other costs as well, which looks like you might be covered to now. So you've got a range of different factors in there. It's not as simple as just carbon.
Yeah, no, exactly.
Yeah, and also like the Devonport, the good numbers for Devonport, it's
Exactly.
As well as on the road. Or
And we're in tier on the roads and all of our infrastructure.
But I would, it takes me an hour and a quarter to get to work in the morning and about an hour to get home at night. And just because of the way the timing of the bus and whatnot works. And I would happily still do that, taking, even if I could have driven it in half the time, because the time when I'm sitting on the ferry is actually productive. It's probably the only uninterrupted time I get in my day. So I'm quite happy on the ferry. It doesn't worry me, and I can finally get a few things done, or read a book, or get online and buy my wife's birthday present, or whatever. So I really resent driving into work because that time's really unproductive. Even if I could have got in faster. And I could, again, like Liam, I mean, it wouldn't take me 2.5 hours from Howick, but it would certainly take me 1.5 hours to drive in the morning if I left it. If I left at 7 driving, I wouldn't get in by the same time I do with public transport.
Do you think they'll ever look at a ferry north of Gulf Harbour?
That's a great question for Liam, because Fuller's had a good look at that. I know you were looking at some. Did you look at anything north of Gulf Harbour?
Yes,
You did?
yes, we did a long time ago. Are we looking at it? Still, there are a lot of things we look at.
Yeah.
It's a question of prioritisation, but I for one would take it.
Well, I mean, it's a matter of where it would go, I suppose, isn't it? You mean still Whangaparoa somewhere, or you mean going up to Maharangi or something?
Maharangi or somewhere around there.
Yeah, Maharangi or Warkworth, somewhere
Yeah,
around
yeah,
there.
yeah.
The Northern Motorway is a major problem.
Yeah.
Adding the size of the motorway has, I've been there since 2016, it's doubled. There's more towns going in, there's more people moving up there. It's a huge area of development, and the Northern Motorway still ends in set of traffic lights.
Yeah.
So whatever you do to that motorway, you've still got that problem.
Yeah.
And you're still quicker to actually travel from on the bus service from Silverdale or Warkworth.
If you can get a park
You
and
can get a
ride,
park.
Yeah.
the park and ride
Yeah,
car
that's
park
true.
is small.
There's always a bottleneck somewhere. Yeah. So look, on its own, people might not actually care about the emissions right all that much. It's interesting. I was reflecting this morning on a conversation that I'd been in a conference in New York at the beginning of last year, Washington DC, and I was framed as this kind of fireside chat with the head of ferries for New York City Ferry, and James and I were sitting on I was talking about economic modelling and electric versus diesel and the benefit of going electric, and he said none of that matters, nobody cares about that. That train's left the station, we're all going electric, it's gonna have to happen, and the funding's there, and how the world has changed in a year and a half. So we do a lot of work in the States, we've got a number of projects up there, and a lot of fortunately the projects that we've currently got underway are not affected by the reduction in federal funding, but some of the projects that we were hoping to be involved in certainly have been. So. But look, with a fleet of ageing boats, I mentioned in 2017 the fleet was ageing. Well, there've hardly been any new boats that have entered the fleet since then, because the recontracting of services in 2017 didn't work because there was kind of a fundamental misalignment between what Auckland Transport was asking for and what they thought it was going to cost them to achieve, because and so that procurement fell over, and so all of the operating of Auckland Transport's ferry services just basically have continued to operate on various kind of extensions and private negotiations and all the rest of it. But it's meant that there's, finally we've really got some new boats entering the fleet almost now with this electric lot. Studies have shown, of course, consistently that people turn away from public transport quite quickly when people can no longer rely on it. I spotted this road sign, it was a year or so ago, or maybe more, but there was Wilson Parking trying to capitalise on we had a whole lot of, there were not only ferry issues at the time, there were train issues and bus issues, and there was this just huge kind of reliability issue with public transport at the time, and Wilson Parking was out there putting up billboards saying, here's the commute that doesn't cancel. And the previous billboard that they'd had, again, was another anti-public transport one. It was something about, the safer commute, you can commute, it was stay in your bubble while you commute, I think that's what it was. But like I said, there have been pretty serious questions already asked about the value of maintaining the Gulf Harbour service, and there have been proposals to drop Northcote Point, eyes are on Birkenhead, and people wondering about what impact the Western Busway is going to have on West Harbour demand. So when I said that this was about saving a ferry service, I really did mean it. And I think we've done a lot towards that. And I'm going to start showing a few gratuitous photos of a nice electric boat that we launched the other day, just in case you get bored of my mug. Thank you. There's been a lot of activity in the electric and hybrid space here in New Zealand now. We launched, obviously, our first boat about a month ago. We've got another one hot on its heels. Fuller's has got a couple of hybrids in build. You've got the electric hydrofoils that Liam showed from Vesev. Obviously, Team New Zealand did their hydrofoiling hydrogen Chase Zero. So, there's quite a lot of that activity going on. And, if you look for a moment at ferries, these boats do make sense. Many of us have done the numbers. We've got a lot of modelling at EV Maritime. AT's done their own modelling. I'm sure Fuller's has as well. I think we all come to the same conclusion, is that yes, electric boats cost more to build for sure, especially the early ones. But the energy and maintenance cost savings which they bring more than make up for that. And as an infrastructure investment, they stack up financially and they bring an emissions benefit. Now, this is very much supported by the fact that ferries in a commuter network like this are very busy, thirsty boats. Take the same ferry and use it half as much, and the economics are a lot more challenging, right? So you've got the same capex hurdle, but fewer operating hours to accumulate the savings that drive the economic benefit to pay for it. So with the commitments that our city and country have made, I think it would be a travesty for Auckland to go back to building diesel boats. But I think in the current political climate, there does remain a risk of that. As in the USA, emissions reduction is not as popular here as it was, and we're seeing a short-term return to fossil fuels. But compared with Europe and Scandinavia, New Zealand and the USA are increasingly outliers in the world. But if I go back far enough, I started on this journey because of the need to save an industry, if not from extinction, then from decline. And over the past few years, we've certainly seen an injection of activity that would not have occurred otherwise. The scale of these projects is significant, and they support a very large number of people across our whole industry. They've also set up our wider industry to serve the needs of our domestic and export markets. And with these first few projects under our belt, we need to work out how to take the learnings from these first boats to drive the cost and complexity out of the projects and drive the safety and confidence and understanding up, very much to Liam's point. That is going to be a collaborative effort across the designers, integrators, builders, surveyors, operators, asset owners, the whole chain. And if we can manage that together, then I think we will be setting our industry up for a really strong future. Now, at EV Maritime, we're mostly focused on ferries. We've got a few collaborations in place in relation to current procurements in Australia, Canada, the USA and Europe. We've got a project underway to design a 19-metre plug-in hybrid vessel for San Francisco, and 3 other projects on the US that are at contract stage at the moment. They're all ferries. Some are composite, some are aluminium, most are electric, one is hydrogen. But where else are we going to see this kind of change? As I said, just focusing on the commercial sector, the commuter ferries are the place where we're seeing this happen first, because they come and go from the same places on quite short runs, and they're really busy. So you can put in the infrastructure, they don't need an enormous range, and they pay themselves back because of the savings they make. Electric is technically practical and economically viable. Perhaps tourism ferries are going to come next, but it's going to be hard in the really highly seasonal locations because of the cost, and they're not running the big hours. I think that the tourism side is kind of going to rely on the mood and demand for decarbonisation as a part of the benefit picture, because the economics on their own aren't going to stack up all that easily just yet, because the cost of carbon's not high enough. And quite a lot of them are probably going to need for a little bit more battery energy density before they're going to have enough range to do what they need to do. But ports are really motivated to decarbonise all around the world. They've been active at decarbonising their shoreside activities for quite a while and installing shore power for cold ironing of vessels. Within the ports, pilot boats are quite analogous to ferries in some respects, short range, fast. There's a few people looking at hydrofoiling for pilot boats, and if that gets traction, I think that'll really open the way for electrification. But even without hydrofoiling, I think that we'll see plenty of pilot boats accepting slightly more moderate speeds to enable them to adopt electrification within conventional hull forms. Tugs are also happening for different reasons. They're all about bollard pull, not speed. They don't mind at all having a whole lot of heavy batteries down there. And Sparky appears to be a pretty good model from what we can see. Tugs isn't really our game. We're very much high performance people, but we're really encouraged by what we see going on there. And I think aquaculture is another field that we're probably going to see some opportunity. There's definitely a lot of inefficiency in those vessels at the moment, with a lot of duplication of equipment. And I think that I'm not quite sure what it would take to go electric, because they tend to have quite short-term, quite short-run, at least in Auckland, relatively short-run propulsive demand, but then reasonably high energy demand through the working day. So they might be more of a candidate for hydrogen, and they do tend to have a fair amount of spare volume below decks. So there's a sort of technical argument for that possibly stacking up. And aquaculture is very much a sort of a sustainability sell as well. So I think that there's definitely, I think we might see some low emission stuff going on in that space. I think inshore commercial fishing is going to be really hard. They tend to go out for several days, which makes electric quite difficult. And they tend to use all their available volume for fish holds, which makes hydrogen challenging. Maybe they will stick with some kind of internal combustion. Maybe they'll go down the methanol path. There's a lot of interesting stuff happening in hydrogen, not only in fuel cells, but in internal combustion of hydrogen. Lots of stuff been going on recently, not only in dual fuel, but also in monofuel installations of internal combustion. So there's quite a few places where we're likely to see that happening. It's not as efficient as a use of hydrogen as fuel cells, but it's a lot more space efficient, and the boats don't need to be nearly as complex. So there's a lot of commercial operators that seem to be thinking more that way at the moment, and we've got one in particular that's looking to go that way. For me, though, I think that whatever the technical solutions and whatever the sector, the common theme that we're going to see is standardisation. To me, it's fundamentally unjustifiable to design every boat from scratch. Not only is it expensive, it's not the pathway to the best boats, and it's not the pathway to the best asset value. Simply put, you're going to spend more on boats that aren't worth as much. So we've got to find our way into standardisation, and not every boat is going to be an EVM 200 by any stretch. There might well be, Margaret, as you say, maybe we can do freight versions of that. I'm more meaning, you know, I'm sure there's still going to be a large number of different boats around, but I think that we are going to see, as we've seen in all the other areas of transportation, we're going to see some convergence and you know, moving into electric is enormously hard for everybody. It's really hard for the designers, it's really hard for the builders, it's really hard for the surveyors, it's really hard for the operators, and it's really hard for the asset owners as well. So as we get a few proven platforms in place, I think there's going to be a strong desire from people to work with things which are already proven, rather than work with things which are to kind of go through and reinvent the wheel. We have not really seen that. That's quite controversial to the industry at the moment, it seems. We're quite committed to it, and pretty much everybody else we know at an industry level that's really focused on electrification of ferries is really focused on it. But on the buyer side, there's still a desire to design something from scratch. So we do find ourselves getting drawn in all the time to being a design consultants and designing custom boats. And much as we like that, it's enormously difficult to justify the cost, and it's really complex. Maybe it's not so bad at the early stages because it gives you a chance to iterate your thinking from the last boat more quickly. But I think standardisation is the big thing that we're going to see ourselves move into. And that's all I had to say. And I don't think I even had, no, I didn't even have any more slides. So thanks. Questions? Sure.
Yeah, questions. Thank you very much.
Steve.
One of the big ones for me is if you could speak about, from your experience of doing this and engagement with the governments and so on in other countries as well, about the total carbon footprint of electrification.
Sure.
And hydrogen in particular, because the country's got to produce the electricity, and for hydrogen, that's bigger electric footprint because it takes more electricity to produce hydrogen to produce,
Yep.
the vessel. So the vessel might be, emission free, but the whole process isn't unless the generation is clean and green.
Yeah.
So how much is what's the current situation, say in New Zealand, for expanding the clean green energy transmission, hydro, wind, etc. So we don't have to import using coal to create energy to power ferries.
Okay, so there's a bit in there. There's some good stuff in there. The kind of marginal demand question is a really interesting one because we use thermal power stations to generate small amounts of our electricity at times, and there's at a surface level you might look at it and say, well, that means every extra kind of every extra electron I use, that must have been made by coal. But there's another. I think that's more about intermittency and of demand and intermittency of supply than it is about total quantum. The total amount of electricity used. Now, my statistic on this is 2 or 3 years out of date, but total amount of electricity used in New Zealand is less than it was in the 1980s. Because of the decline of manufacturing, and there's more consented renewable energy capacity, generation capacity, than the total capacity of the national grid today. No one's building it.
Right.
Why aren't they building it? Because there isn't a consistent demand for the electricity. So ironically, while the short-term case there may be some cases where increasing demand leads to using more fossil fuels in the short run. In the longer run, it's actually the path to fully decarbonising. Until we have more demand, we won't fully decarbonise the New Zealand grid. So there's that side of it. Where we're seeing demand for hydrogen is definitely in countries where they are looking to utilise the green electricity that they've got, and it's all in a sort of heavily subsidised form at the moment still, in the places where we're seeing demand for it. But green hydrogen that's created from the electrolysis of water using electricity sourced from renewable generation, uses a lot more electricity to make that hydrogen than what you would use to just put that energy into a battery. But you wouldn't use hydrogen to run a ferry from here to Devonport or even a ferry from here to Half Moon Bay, but you would use it where you need to decarbonise and where your range where your range is too much for what you could do with battery, or if the infrastructure overhead associated with putting a charger in somewhere. Take Gulf Harbour, for example. You want to electrify that? You can electrify that, absolutely. You can that boat get to Gulf Harbour, and then it'll take 25 minutes to charge up at a charger that'll probably cost $20 million to install. And if it takes 25 minutes to charge up, then if you look at the service frequency, it means you need an extra boat so that you can have a boat sitting alongside charging in the meantime. So that then pushes the economics towards different ways of solving that problem.
And similarly, when you look at the statistics, the analysis of like CO2 emissions, for example, do you take into account the electrical generation of the country that you work that out?
Yeah, we do. So
Look at the whole footprint.
yeah, so we've been doing some life cycle analysis. So that's where you look at sort of cradle to grave emissions. So you've got your boat and you say, okay, well that boat's, interestingly we did it because that boat's built out of carbon fibre. And we built it out of carbon fibre because that was the enabling technology that meant that we could build a boat that was efficient enough to deliver the service as an electric boat. And we knew that the operational emissions that we would save were worth putting in some, spending a bit more emissions in manufacture. Interesting thing we discovered was that when you look at a carbon fibre boat, there's about 12 tonnes of structure in that boat there. There's about 4 tonnes of carbon fibres, there's about 4 tonnes of foam, and there's about 4 tonnes of resin. And some of that foam is recycled PET, and some of it's virgin PVC. So when you've got, if that structure had been built out of aluminium, there'd be about 20 tonnes of aluminium. Aluminium has about half the emissions intensity per tonne of what carbon fibre does. But overall, when you take carbon and foam and resin, the emissions intensity of the raw materials that you manufacture a carbon fibre boat from are significantly less. I forget what it is. I think it was maybe about 30% less than what it was for an aluminium boat after you account for recovery of the scrap. And then you've got your operating phase, and it's just, we've compared diesel versus hybrid versus electric, and carbon versus aluminium, and whatever you do in the operating phase over 30 years blows everything else that you do out of the water. And then you get to the end of life and you say, well, you take this boat, how do you scrap it? What's the process? What do you do with your aluminium boat? What do you do with your carbon fibre boat? What's the process for recovering the carbon fibre? Does it, and you account for that. And right at the moment, you would account for aluminium as being slightly better than carbon fibre from an end of life perspective, but they're both tiny little blips on the chart. Part of the reason for that is that there are very few carbon fibre structures that are up for recycling at the moment. There's much more value in post-use carbon fibre than there is in post-use glass fibre. So when we start, actually, there's a lot of technology there for recycling carbon fibre structures, but there's just no demand for doing it at the moment. But from a life cycle point of view, really, it's all about how you use the boat. And then, yes, we definitely do look at what the emissions intensity of the electricity is. And you get into funny things when you go, oh, well, this public transport authority has a policy of only buying their electricity from renewable sources versus what's the average out of the grid and which number do you take and so on. But
do the electric motors and electrical systems have a longer life duration than diesel, comparable diesel motor? Like a diesel motor is going to have so many hours before it has to be replaced or overhauled.
yeah, the electric motors should have a lot more. The batteries will have less. So, well, actually, I don't know, on average, how often are you replacing motors? In years?
30,000 hours or something, right?
What are you doing? 30,000 hours for a motor? For an engine, rather?
20 to 30. Depends.
20 or 30,000 hours, you're doing 5,000 hours. So actually, you're replacing an engine about as frequently, maybe slightly less frequently than you're replacing batteries. What's that, 5 to 7? So we're expecting about 7 years out of the batteries in this boat.
Danfoss don't actually publish service intervals for the electric motors.
No.
There's no end of life for electric motors.
Yeah, just keep spinning, just change the gear every time.
Yeah, I mean, there's not a lot of
gearbox, is there?
no, in our case, there's no gearbox. No, that's right. It's just direct coupled to the jets. So, so when you look at modelling out, you do that cost modelling or your life cycle emissions modelling. But you've got everything from on a diesel boat from changing the oil and filters through to replacing engines and everything in between. But you've also got, you know, redoing your anti-foul and sorting out corrosion issues and all the rest of it.
The economic, you know, Michael said about modelling, we do a lot of modelling as well, and the economic case for electric boats is just a no-brainer. Simple no-brainer. You never go over the TC to cost production.
Unfortunately, we're just really bad at making that no-brainer decision.
Yeah.
Like,
So
all the accountants will get around in a room and completely agree that the total cost of ownership, the net present value, all of these things, yep, that makes more sense. And they'll go, yeah, but we can't justify that capex. So you just did justify that capex.
how
So-
can you not?
Yeah, Michael, one of the things that I'd be really keen to see in terms of modelling is just picking up on the better utilisation of the fleet, where you've got, say, for example, Adam's got it straight up and down the West Park, busy in peak hours, bobbing up and down in the middle. Meanwhile, you've got 60 courier vans going in the same direction. If you factored in the CO2 emissions of those and the time taken, Gold Harbour, for example, I don't know, 40, 50 trucks a day, feeding the supermarket chains and whatnot. Obviously, you need to still have an element of trucking there, but not all of it.
Shifting to a
and
last
one of the
mile
things
thing.
that when I went out to Mainfreight and had a look at them loading their containers, just about every parcel was about this big. It just goes into the big rail carts and the big containers. But they all go to different places.
Yeah.
But they all end up at the same port. No reason why they can't end up in the same place for us. And then have local community drivers picking up, which feeds the community as well. That might look a bit different if we really utilised our fleet to work at 100% capacity, and then factored in the cost of taking all those heavy transport vehicles off the routes.
Yeah, it's interesting. There's if you go back to the ferry procurement that Auckland Transport had a go at back in 2017, one of the features of that was quite made a lot of sense was to kind of harmonise the standard of service and the frequency of service across a number of most of the routes. Because still at the moment we have this quite weird setup where certain services have weekend services and certain ones don't, and some of them are only at peak times, and then the boats sit around all day long doing nothing, and other times they run all the way through. And it's just it's a result of this kind of just continuing to just extend existing contracts, because it's really hard, I guess, to contract. I mean, look, there's a whole Western procurement going on at the moment for West Harbour, Birkenhead, Bayswater, Northcote, and Rakina, and so that procurement is happening. And actually, they've got a new portal, and I haven't even been able to download the documents for it yet, so I don't even know what they're asking for. But we know there's no money for electric boats in it, so.
It's a heavily subsidised industry, right? And it's subsidised from councils. That's my assumption, from what I know. I mean, what percentage of the operating costs of a ferry operation is subsidised?
Well, Liam will be able to correct me, but I think roughly across Auckland ferries, it's roughly third. It's 1/3 fare box, 1/3 council, 1/3 central government, in very rough terms. Is that about right? I think that, I mean, it's roughly about right. Yeah, it's subsidised. I mean, it's public transport. It's a public good. You know, there are people who argue it should all be free.
Roads, right? Yeah.
So are roads, heavily subsidised. Yeah.
Yeah.
A couple of questions. First one, is there a consultation or some sort of process with exporters to up their green trading capacity? So I know, like, Zesper's got 2 ships, Intervin, who manage Donna Maria, currently looking to explore that use trucking as just a ship show to get their goods around the country. So one is there a process around that. And the second one is, might include my meeting as well. Global shipping is about 2% of total global emissions. New Zealand's is about 9 or 10%, I think, off the top of my head. So
See you, mate.
If we ship more around the country, does that affect anything to do with like the IMO net zero by 2050 or anything the Climate Change Commission's put forward in the past year? Will it just be like truck bombings that make, for example, against the maritime sector to fight everything on roads, maritime keeping it?
Does coastal shipping sit in land transport? Is it? I know ferries sit as basically oddly as land transport within.
And IMO is big ship.
It's big ship international. So where does coastal sit? I don't know.
So local shipping is not. Some of the stuff in IMO is relevant to our domestic shipping sector, but not all. So there's a lot of flexibility. And bear in mind too, this whole submission process isn't to take away from our big shippers. There will still be a need for those guys, but they will use the deep ports and have the big ships. 100 metre ships still be necessary. So we're not going to be taken away, because there's a lot of panic about that from the shipping boys. But we are just going to probably give them more, because they also have underutilised fleet. What we're trying to do is grow the 2 regional coasters into 100, 300 to transport stuff and help the land transport move their stuff around more efficiently. So that might mean more ro-ros, that might mean a combination of passenger and freight, all sorts of things, all sorts of ideas, it's all open. But we do need government support like they have in Australia. Someone asked me a question about how other countries do it. Australia have absolutely all government funded vessels, all taxpayers' money for, say, dock equivalent in Australia must use Australian locals. Over here we don't have that. You can buy a boat anywhere, and unfortunately they do. And a lot of the money lasts 3, 4, 5 years. They don't build them as well. That's why New Zealand don't build them.
As well, like the cost benefit of building inside New Zealand is clear as well. Is that with everything we're doing? We are promoting building inside New Zealand.
High ticket price?
There is no benefit.
Yeah.
There is no benefit in building in developed world countries. It's better to do it onshore.
Yeah, and that's a message that Phyllis has been tireless in bringing on behalf of the New Zealand industry, I'd have to say, for quite a long time, because there was a pretty big push with for a while there to build offshore, and gosh, I mean, when Transport for New South Wales did it, it didn't go well for them, but it's yeah. So no,
it's been a lot of Australia.
Yeah.
Michael, I think that's a wrap. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
I've really enjoyed this afternoon, guys. I hope you all have. Just a couple of thank yous. Peter, thank you again for allowing us to come and use your lovely facility. Joe popped in and has popped out again. Will you say thanks to Joe? Because Joe's organised all of this facility today and sorted out our food and everything else. So thank you, Joe. Thank you to all our speakers. Couldn't have done this without them, and they gave freely of their time, which is much appreciated. I've got a few magazines here. Please, if you haven't got one, take a copy with you. There's only 6 left. And just, anytime you want to reach out to me at HQ, do. I love talking to RMS members, and I have a lot of members I have a regular dialogue with. One last question for you before we go, and those of you who are going to come and have a beer. We have a number of WhatsApp groups now that we've launched over the last couple of years. Would you like a New Zealand WhatsApp group for IMS? Would that be beneficial? Would that something you like to do? Have we launched it? Oh, last week. All right, ahead of the game then. There you go. So, what I love about them, we've got one in the UK for canal boat guys, the narrowboat guys. There's only 9 in the group. Do you know they are chatting every day on the group? And someone will put a picture in and say, oh, I've never seen one of those before. And then some guy says, oh, yeah, I know what that is. It's all this exchange of ideas. So we've launched it. Oh, there you go. Yeah. Join it, please. So thank you very much. Thanks to you guys for coming. And,